welcome everybody to Decolonizing Bees. We're going to hear a lecture from Brian Dykstra on an interesting topic. I'd never considered how Western honeybees were making an impact on cultures. So this is going to be an interesting lecture. It's not your typical insect lecture. It's kind of a sociology lecture, and one dealing with the background that Brian has, which is anthropology. So I'm going to let Brian introduce himself, but I want to just point out that he has been an instructor at Humboldt State University, has degrees in anthropology, biology, and environmental policy. And so we also have with us, who is a co-host, Terry Smith out of Piedmont, California, who is one of the co-leaders of the Pollinator Posse. I'm going to let Terry talk about the Pollinator Posse just a minute and kind of give us a background of why she's co-host.
Well, the Pollinator Posse was started by Tora Rocha and myself, based in the gardens at Lake Merritt. At the time, she was the supervisor there, and I was a science teacher in nearby Piedmont, and we've been collaborating ever since, trying to get the word out about the problems pollinators are having, what pollination even is and why it's important, and what we can do. And our latest piece, which those of you who are involved with the Posse will be hearing about, is we've kind of been charged with collecting data on the changes in what's happening with the monarch population this year. There was a huge dip. It went from 30,000 to 2,000 on the coast. However, we're seeing inland monarchs like we've never seen before, and we don't have a data gathering system for that. So we'll shortly be putting out some surveys, and we'll be acting as the center of gathering that data for Northern California. So we're also, of course, very interested in native bees and honeybees and anything else that does pollination.
Yeah. So the Pollinator Posse is one of the groups that actually puts the things that Brian talks about into effect. They digest the information that's coming from universities and researchers, and they put it into practice, and then they train others to do the same thing. So we're going to get started. Brian, I know you want to say more about your background, so go ahead and start that, and we're ready for you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Eddie, and thank you everyone for being here. I appreciate everyone being here. Today I'm going to be talking something that it certainly is entomology, but it's also just as much about people as it is about bees today. So the Decolonizing Bees. I have like a PowerPoint that I'm going to present, and I'm really interested in questions or discussion afterwards. I think, I may answer questions, or you may find a better question that you want to ask at the end. I'm not sure how long it'll take. It's like 100 slides. So yeah, I say let's go. All right. So Decolonizing Bees. I wonder why this title was catchy to me. I wonder why it might be catchy to anyone else. I think it has to do with what often people think of when they hear the word bee or bees. And if you take a moment and think of what came to mind when you heard the word bee, I wonder, did you think of queen bees, colonies, honey or stings, maybe white boxes, personal protective equipment, swarms? Maybe pollination or colony collapse disorder. So you've had a moment here to think about what what comes to mind when you hear the word bees, whether it's in the news or when you're saying it, when someone else is saying it. And often people come up with these, and colony collapse disorder and pollination, when they hear the word bee. The reality is, most bee species are not colonial. They do not live in colonies, and there's not intergenerational contact. Sisters or daughters don't share responsibilities for provisioning for the young, or building a nest, or defense of the young. So often, a lot of them, they're called solitary bees, even if they live gregariously next to each other. is that there's no intergenerational contact, and they don't share the responsibilities for provisioning or for the young, building a nest, etc. Bees are actually really diverse in color. If you thought of a honeybee flying around when you heard the word bee, bees are really diverse. And some of this is real background information here, but there's bees come in every shape, size, and color. They come out at different times of year. Some pollinate flowers better than others. There's many different lifestyles among the 20,000 plus species of bees in the world. That's a lot of bee species. I want to say that when we think of bee diversity, we can also think of cultural diversity. Hold on. Okay. Here is something that Wade Davis, he's called the ethnosphere, which is a cultural web of life. He's saying it's the sum total of all thoughts and intuitions, myths and belief, ideas and inspirations brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. So just like the Earth might be surrounded by a ecosphere or a biosphere, it's also surrounded by a cultural web of life. And that's really important to think about, because when we think of bees, we have a cultural perceptions of bees and how many bees are out there. That's our human perception. It's not necessarily the reality. The reality is our understandings of nature and culture are really intertwined. Lisa Maffei with Terra Lingua talks about biocultural diversity. And what you find when you look at the connection is that the higher the linguistic diversity, the higher the biodiversity, and there's a tight connection between that. Simplified cultures tend to have simplified ecosystems. When we think of it this way, though, we have to think about what is disappearing faster. Is biodiversity disappearing faster, or is the biocultural diversity? You think, well, if there's 7,000 languages in the world, and how many species of bees? 20,000? Which is disappearing faster? This is just the United States for an example. We have over 200 languages in the country. Most of them are endangered, not just a few. So sometimes our perceptions of, what's endangered has to do with, kind of your perception bias. When we think of even the fact that we're all here on Zoom and I'm speaking in English, how many people have access to the internet? How many of those 7,000 languages in the world have access to the internet or have their language in writing? This is a nice report that estimates 7% of the world languages are captured in published materials. Not very many, and even less are online. Even so, lots of people are going online. So you see this cultural transformation of knowledge generation, unfortunately, is happening so much in English or Spanish or Chinese, a few languages, and not so much in the others. We're not learning from the minorities as English speakers or as main language speakers. So here's an example. Percentage of websites using various languages, 50% are English. So what does that mean, say, when we come back to bees? Here's a nice book I thought would be nice. It's supposed to be about bees and human cultures. And Claire Preston writes, there are surprisingly few Far Eastern bee traditions. In many Asian cultures, there was relatively little demand for honey. I guess that's her reasoning why. The thing is, Claire Preston is a Shakespearean expert, and apparently, she didn't look up enough stuff, because this is totally and blatantly false. And she does discuss other bees, not just the European honeybee. But unfortunately, she's neglected to see one, that kind of perception bias, like, well, how much of that culture is available for you to read, and can you understand that? would you get a translation of it? So that's one reason, like kind of the information that we're given. How do we understand issues around bees? If we look at a few different countries and public perception about bees, in the United States, 99% of respondents believe that bees are important, but only 14% were able to guess within 1,000 the actual number of bee species in the US. The majority of people were magnitudes of order off. Most people guessed far below 50 or 100 even, when the actual number of bee species in the United States is 4,000. So when these people are putting their heads together and saying, let's solve problems for bees, perhaps they're not applying that to the bees that need it, or to bees that they could benefit. Here's another article in which honeybees are seen as the queens of mass media in Australia, where the majority of media articles discuss European honeybees, the images, often beekeeping honeybees. Only 15% of stories even mention native bees as pollinators, but there's over 1,500 native bees in Australia. Some are managed, some are very important. Many are very important for pollination of plants and maintaining ecosystem services. In Canada, a study found that 50% believe that the non-native managed European honeybee is native to Canada. This is a species that's not native to the Americas. And so when half of the country has this belief of a bee species being native, it does affect conservation issues and public policy. Here's the Sierra Club's website. I took a screenshot the other day, which says 1/3 of our food supply relies on a very sick species, honeybees. That's not true. 1/3 of our food supply is heavily dependent on insect pollination to vector the pollen to give us those yields. But it's certainly not a single species doing that. Honeybees are endangered. Well, not on a state or federal level and not on an international level, but thank you, Sierra Club. So these misconceptions are perpetrated through mass media. In fact, we could go adopt a wild animal and adopt a honeybee from the Sierra Club. This isn't just to take down the Sierra Club. I know they wrote one nice article about honeybees competing with native bees, but still, this is kind of a sock puppet here. Help me save the bees. Really, we're doing great work for this non-native animal that's currently not facing endangerment. So purchase required. For promotion purposes only, European honeybees managed by commercial beekeepers using industrial agriculture will be safe, right? Well, if you want to learn more about this kind of thing, you can look at beewashing.com. There's a great person who's put together some examples of bee washing in general. That is kind of getting public attention for a product or an idea by saying that you're going to save the bees. And this even goes further when people are saying, well, we'll sell you native bees. And even if those bees aren't native and can't be guaranteed as native, if people go, oh, I know honeybees aren't native, so I'll get these other kinds. It's problematic because sometimes these bees are not native, and shipping commercialization of animals can lead to disease spreading and such. So, what do you do? Time to order some bluebirds when you get the bluebird house. The thing is, we don't have to treat animals like commercial products to support them and to help the ecosystem with support them. The Bee Conservancy is another example of a organization that's working really hard to be bee friendly and include native bees, but the majority of their outreach and material is all about honeybees. Across the map, they're helping honeybees. And I can talk about why this is a problem, and I'm going to get to that. But what I want to get across is that honeybees, European honeybees, are given a lot of attention, and there's a lot of misperceptions about them that lead to people to believe that there's real problems facing them that we need to solve first before any others. If we look at the United States as an example, we have a lot of state insects or state agricultural insects, and I can't think of any. In fact, there are none that have chosen a native bee. A lot of animals that are chosen from states are native for things, but when it comes to insects, the United States is not doing so well. So perhaps the map is not the territory. Our mental maps of what the problem is or who bees are could use some education, and really that's the best tool to solving problems and creating solutions, is to have a better idea of where you're at and who's out there. So it's not just honeybees all the way down. The reality is bees are really diverse, and I'm going to emphasize that throughout the talk. Bees have symbolized and meant within human cultures many things. There's a very involved taxonomies involving dozens and dozens of species. Even back in the late 1800s, European school systems in the U.S. as well. If you were lucky enough to go to school, a nice school, you would be learning different kinds of bees, and you'd be taught common names. It's not the case. Usually schools will call up a European honey beekeeping club to say, here, come give a presentation about bees to the school. So there's a lot of miseducated youth and adults. But human cultures have been, being there 20,000 species in the world, and over 7,000 languages, and more cultures than that across the board have included bees within environmental ethics, concepts of the origin of the earth or this world, moral guidance. You see the list. It's not just food, medicine, and pollination or technology. One misperception is that here in North America, that Native Americans across the board didn't have words for bees, and they called honeybees the white man's fly. The reality is this was a term that was developed by Pastor John Eliot, the apostle to the Indians, so to speak, who didn't believe that the Algonquian people had a name for bee, and so that was something he wrote, and then a lot of people followed suit. This was actually the first Bible printed in the New World that included the Old and New Testament, and it was in a language that John Eliot put in writing for the Algonquian people. So these are some projections and misconceptions that, if you're not from Western civilization, you don't know about European honeybees. In fact, you don't know about bees. It's just a wrong perception. That there is no native words for bee, honey, or wax is wrong. Across the United States, or what is now known as the United States, there are plenty of words and still used today. I hear a lot of discussions about how, well, honeybees were native, so they kind of are native. So what I'm doing with beekeeping is certainly just falling right in with that line. However, it was a different species that lived here 14 million years ago. It was an Apis species. And I like to refer people back to the paper, which described the fossil here, because it indicates that the restricted range of the species and its eventual extinction is what allowed the stingless bees. These are social bees that produce honey. Some of them are managed in the wild or kept in hives. It allowed them to diversify. So actually its disappearance in the Americas allowed a great diversity to emerge amongst other bees. Columbus noted a variety of honey in his 1493 letter. So this is something where he called the New World land of milk and honey, and he actually found honey. You say, well, if there weren't honeybees here, what was he finding? Later in 1496, at fear of being shot by rifles and cannons, the native people left their village, and the crew of Columbus's ship, but this is their second voyage, pillaged the honey and wax. These are, I guess you could say, only additional crimes on top of everything else. But the thing is, that island, the Cordocara, which is the beautiful waters, or Guadalupe Island, has there's an endemic bee species found there, and just an adjacent island. It's a Melipona species, and that's among other species that are also found there that produce honey and wax. And there's a lot to say about the Caribbean, but I'm gonna stay on target here with getting some of this boring stuff with this original European contact out of the way. Diego de Landa Calderon, he noticed that there was other kinds of bees here that were producing honey. He thought the honey was most excellent, of course. That they don't sting was very nice when you gather the honey, as he writes. And this is a Mexican artist, Fernando Castro Pacheco, his take on Diego de Landa Calderon, who was this religious figure who decided that all kinds of books, Maya codices, and other images had to be burned in 1562. And we lost a lot of knowledge of the traditions that people had, long-standing traditions, keeping and managing bees, and their inclusion in other cultural aspects such as religion. We do have some remaining texts to look at, as well as there's people still keeping these bees today throughout Central America. There's the bee is kind of the orange figure, center left. Well, there's a lot of images from the different cultures. Archaeologists like to uncover honey and wax were important for tribute to the civilizations at the time. Bees were kept in log hives as well as ceramic hives, and multiple bee species were managed. At this point today, there's real concern that the species, not just Melipona beechi, but also other stingless bee species are going extinct, and the practice of keeping them around is going extinct. And a lot of this has to do with introduced European honeybees. It also has to do with the fact that the International Alimentary Codex and Codices have defined honey as, for international sale, have pretty much defined honey as coming from only European honeybees. And so the amount of testing to say, like, how do you ship honey from a stingless bee when it's a little different than European honeybee honey? Well, the lack of interest, economic pressure, all kinds of deforestation. When you look at it, though, there's room for hope. Although nearly 70% of local experts interviewed considered that stingless bees were going to disappear relatively soon in this area of Mexico, still there were 11 wild native bee species that were utilized for honey and wax. And both men and women are heavily involved in the processing for the honey and wax for food, medicine, and other things. And researchers are working to help keep this knowledge alive. There's a movie you could watch out there. It's pretty short, called Honey for the Maya, by Stephen Buckman. It's worth watching if you want to learn more about Mayan beekeeping with Melipona beechi anyways. But there's a lot of these economic pressures that have led men to be working outside of traditional milpas. And so women have said, well, we will take over the role of keeping these bees. And there's a great Indigenous women cooperatives that you can read about that have been working to keep this tradition and these traditions alive. The Totonac people have a story of the origin of vanilla that involves a woman of royal background who fell in love with a more commoner. And it was an unrequited love story because they were unable to consummate their love and be married. But her arranged marriage, that evil guy, basically, there's different versions. In one version, he kills her and then her lover takes his life. In one version, he turns her into a vanilla plant, and then he kills the lover who turns into the bee. But either way, in some of the stories, she's turning into the vanilla plant, and he's turning into the bee, forever floating around her fragrance. This is an example. I'm not going to go into every similar story across the world because there are plenty where the pollinator and the plant are actually lovers that are meeting together in that insect plant world now. But so when vanilla was moved outside of its native range, say all the way to Asia and far off east the coast of Africa, it didn't do so well. As nice as vanilla was for it to be shipped to Europe for Europeans, they said, but how could we really get our own stuff going with this outside of just having it always shipped from Mexico and Central America? And Europeans basically brought vanilla plants many places, but it wouldn't produce vanilla pods very often. It's an orchid, it needs pollination, and it is pollinated by a stingless bee. So there was efforts to bring stingless bees to new locations to help that, but that didn't work out. So I just wanted to let you know this pollination story. Edmund, who was an enslaved African in a French colony, he was responsible for pollinating cucurbits, which have male and female flowers. And so he'd move pollen between the male flowers to the female flowers, because at the time, honeybees and other bees weren't able to be moved around so successfully, to new places. And so he applied that knowledge to the unfruitful vanilla plants and took a closer look and was the first person to develop an effective means of hand pollinating vanilla. And so that's why there's a few statues too commemorating his contributions. Now, being enslaved, he remained in that condition, but within a few years of his discovery, they went from the island of Reunion in the Indian Ocean, went from exporting 0 pounds of vanilla beans to tons. So here I am, I'm talking about, conquistadors and slavery, and what does that have to do with bees? If I take a step farther back in time, because it's this Western tradition. It has been part of a Western tradition. So let's get back to Plato, at least, go that far back, founder of Western political philosophy, and he founded the first Western institution of higher learning. That's him on the right there, and the honeybees are surrounding his lips. They're going to help him be wise and be eloquent. He went on to write such things as, cities find colonization in some respects easier if the colonists are one race, which, like a swarm of bees, is sent out from a single country. There is nothing which tends more to the improvement of mankind than legislation and colonization. And he kind of set he was part of setting the stage there for the ideas of what colonization means. This is a 13th century fresco, but it's actually showing a purported 4th century transfer of authority. So the political authority that Rome had was being given over to the Pope, to religious authority. So it's kind of, if you're looking at it as a pyramid scheme, you have God, you have the Pope, and then you get the Roman Empire, and then you get, the subjects in the colonies, etc. So, but what's in that document, what's interesting, is this graphic, which comes with the text translated from Latin here: highest rule, sown fields of cultivated land, production of honey. These 3 symbolize these greater things. So honeybees have long been the symbol in the Western tradition of a monarchy, of a queen or king, often, as it was very gendered toward males. For a long time, people had a hard time letting go of that. People knew for a long time before they could stop saying king about queen or mother honeybees, the egg-laying mother. But the idea here, what you're seeing here is like that is the political or religious authority, and those are the peons doing the work. So it's all about cultivating, it's all about domestication, it's all about being productive for the colony. Here's another example. There's the king, and then there's the ruling class, and then there's the worker class, and then there's the drone, the Fuchis or such down there on the bottom that are just, they're not contributing anything. So within the colonial mentality, if you're not contributing toward the top of the pyramid, you really ought to get kicked out. And colonies were described as like not producing honey for the British Empire. I would bore the heck out of myself if I looked at every image and read everything that would exemplify what I'm describing here. Trust me, it's out there. It's pervasive, and it gets kind of boring. But let's get back to North America. Swarm to the New World, as bees do when they need to, and create new colonies. The idea that those terms are synonymous or overlap or the same has to do with Western ideas of bees in general. They work for you, and we're supposed to be like them in a political system and a social system. Work really hard. You're not in charge. Someone else is. Okay, and that those ideas of manifest destiny and the fact that until the better organism and people populate the earth is right in line. The author Rob Hardy writes, in a sense, the honeybees and the settlers are one and the same, both industrious agents of domestication. Here's an image from an early book on honeybees by A.I. Root, showing America kind of as this is taken from the one of the first honeybee equipment factories in the United States. Honeybees are thought of bringing order to the United States, bringing order to a wild land. And, the idea that people held worker bees, and guess what? It wasn't just European white people sitting around working hard. Often these bees were enslaved Africans and, doing a lot of the work. So I want you to think about it like that as well. This is the Desiree. I'm gonna never found a Church of Mormon person to ask, is that T silent? But Deseret stone. This is in a Washington monument put there in 1853. That is the word for honeybee for the Mormons, and they came up with their own alphabet, which was called the Desiree alphabet. That was supposed to be their homeland, the honeybee. And it all ties into the symbolism of working hard. We have the religious authority to go where we're going. This is some of the alphabet in play. It was dropped. They didn't keep going with it, but a curiosity. But here's the idea that the political system should be operating like a bunch of honeybees in a hive. Like I said, there's a lot of examples of it, but here's one of the British beehive. It says, but that's emulated in the United States and elsewhere. The idea that the political beehive, industry, commerce, cooperation, adherence to social, political, gender, and racial hierarchies, and you have to tax those people, otherwise there's going to become drones. Okay, so the Capitol has been in the news recently, and I see, so I'll include it, but you'll see, like, does that model fit it? Do we think of like, no, this is a democracy, so it's really not the top-down thing? Well, let's look at the top of the Capitol building, and from the bottom though. Look inside and go look up. There's George Washington, and the founder, our first president. He sat on a beehive in the Potomac, and while crossing the Potomac in 1776, and he was a beekeeper. People like to say, and the thing is, this is literally called the apotheosis of Washington, that he's rising to the power of a god. It's right there in our Capitol building. And the thing is, this is why it upsets me anyways, that people want to talk about how awesome we were founded by, someone who keeps bees. He had enslaved Africans that kept honeybees, and that's where he got his honey. And after they escaped, they were returned and continued to have to do that for him. So, we haven't taken that down off our Capitol. There you go. There's something. But but it has to do with a racial hierarchical ordering that was seen as justified, and it went right down to the political, right down to the individual relationships that people had to try to fit that model. And it's not working, and it's ebbed into our environmentalism for a long time. So that's where we got to go with this. Okay. So Henry David Thoreau wrote this. Um, but the domination of the landscape in this continent, the conquering of the better bee and the better people was the narrative. And Henry David Thoreau saw that. Lots of people saw that. I would bore us going too far, but I'm trying to talk about some environmentalists that talk about these things. John Muir really thought honeybees were pretty cool. He did call them sweet-winged cattle, though, so we'll get back to the cattle thing. But he thought it's just the grand epic in bee history that they could come to California and have all these wonderful, pristine nature, untouched nature is in his ideas. So he gave advice on establishing bee ranches, and there you see one from 1890 ABC of bee culture in the mountains of California. Well, what are the impacts of that thinking that, we have the better bee and that we can, we've been able to kind of through apiculture have a monoculture of a certain species, and just tap those resources, are we taxing the landscape in this way? I took some pictures. Hopefully you can see them. No. Okay. I just was up there. These are the best pictures. These are a little blurry. This is a camas. This is a traditional food from Canada down to, the Sierras in California, also inland. It's a traditional food, it's highly nutritious. It's a, staple food. And people still process this and eat this, but it's having reductions in seed set when European honeybees visit it. And this is an example of how they visit. They tend, for the most part, to visit without contacting the stigma, without collecting pollen before contacting the stigma. If they do, they're usually just drinking that nectar, taking it, and making honey. And so there's some graduate research there to show that hives placed in areas of this traditional food plant reduce seed set because the nectar is being extracted, and definitely in some cases the pollen is being extracted, but it's not being transferred effectively between the plants compared to the native bees, which are much more effective. And so does that have an effect on the native bees? Well, first, if you want to look at it from a human-centric perspective, if you like having the camas around in long term, it's not just bees that help it, it's people too help it be around. There's been a lot of traditional management for thousands of years. Fire, a lot of these plants, when they look at the genetics and they look at the morphology, it's the fact that they've been harvested with some left that has led to the current genetics and the current root shapes and basically their ecology and biology has been shaped by indigenous people for tens of thousands of years. And those relationships also have been existing for a long time with native bees. And so there's a few disturbances that are interfering with a traditional food, with what you could say food sovereignty, as well as if you're concerned just about the ecosystem. You can't see that one either. It's stealing nectar bottom. I didn't make that right. So this research is by Maureen Page, who's also working on some other great projects. I don't have a link there for it, but a great reading group on important issues for scientists to think about social issues. I got this, some of the quotes from her stuff. She's presented at some meetings here, Kathy Keatley Garvey wrote a nice article about it right there. Here's another picture I took, again, a little blurry, but this is a native solitary bee, and it's visiting a brodea, another traditional food, tended as a, let's say this is, I'm not using this as a past tense word here, by indigenous people. And this little bee is doing a great job pollinating the plant. So, but here we are in California, we're thinking about native peoples and native foods and the connection with native bees and the other people who show up. So if you've ever heard of Fremont, there's a lot of places named after him. On the way to California, he went up a peak in Wyoming, which became named Fremont Peak. He put the American flag up there. And someone first indicated, sorry, I can't see this. Here on the summit, where the stillness was absolute, unbroken by any sound, and the solitude complete, we thought ourselves beyond the region of animated life. But while we were sitting on the rock, a solitary bee, Bromus the humblebee, it's a social bee, but it was alone, came winging on his flight, probably a her, but okay, from the Eastern Valley, and lit on the knee of one of the men. Oh, of course, John Charles Fremont really pushed the idea that it landed on him, and he got mocked for it by other people. You know, he was involved in the whole political world for his like conquest of finding a bee. But I like this other account of it by D.A. Shaw, in which he caught the bee and pressed it between the leaves of his journal. I like it because it shows how callous this person is, and it's just for him. You know, oh, I found a bee. Oh, I got to a peak. Let's name it after me. Put a flag up there. Very little respect for the landscape, and it's not treated like this might already have a name, this peak, or that bee might have someplace to go. Well, when Fremont got to California and tried to make a stand against a Mexican army, he climbed up to the top of a mountain, which was known as the Toyotoc. For the Amamutsin people in California, they've written a letter to Governor Newsom insisting that the state change the name of the locations that are named after persons who committed atrocities against California Native Americans. Here's this place that's called Fremont Park, but it you know, people have been saying, no, well, how I see it is I walk around a place that has this story. There's a whole story behind the place of the Bumblebee. And there's a nice newspaper article written by an Amamutsin writer, which describes the story. There's a lot of landscape stories that involve honeybees helping create the landscape. And I think it's shows a respect for the earth to, it can contribute to that, to actually exist in a place and be thinking of a story that does not involve, say, genocide, and the type of things that Fremont is forever associated with. Okay, I'm going to try to go to the next slide, but it's not letting me. There we go. Since we're on the Pacific Northwest, I'll share a couple stories because bees are also involved in cultural stories regarding the productivity of plants. In the folk tales of the Coast Salish, there's a great story about a trickster figure named Blue Jay. And so I'm already giving something away, Trickster. Well, he goes and visits his sister, who happens to be in the land of the dead. He visits his sister in this story. Go back to the land of the living. Please take this basket with you, and I want you to bring this basket back to the land of the living. Whatever you do, don't open it. So no tricks, right? Of course, Blue Jay is too curious, and he opens the basket, and a bunch of bees fly out. And maybe a little patience and seeing that connection. Anthropologists noted that the tribes of the Pacific Northwest saw a strong connection between hymenopterous insects and fruits, plant yields. This is a picture of a potlatch, part of a potlatch gathering. Potlatch is a Chinook jargon, so language that different tribes could communicate to each other with in the Pacific Northwest of North America. Shared language, because a large number of these tribes have potlatch ceremonies, and these are gatherings that involve a lot of family moments, feasting, dancing, generous giving of gifts, especially a lot of dances that are really involved and ceremonial. This was outlawed in Canada until 1951. So of course there's people in living memory saying, wow, you know, my grandparents didn't know that, or my parents didn't know that, except for through subterfuge, you know, hiding from, because the elaborately carved masks, it's still going on, but at the time, if you had one of those masks, it could be taken. And you could also be put in prison for a certain amount of time, even for encouraging another indigenous person to go to a potlatch ceremony.
And so just possessing these masks was illegal.
Possessing the mask was illegal. Making the mask was illegal. And in this manner, of course, whites in Canada said, "Oh, well, I want one. I get to have one because it's not associated with any sort of paganism with me." You know, they would get them. A lot of them ended up in museums, which is where this story is going. Okay, so this is a museum display / art display. And I want to give as much credit out there as possible. But Marianne Nicholson made this display with her families on her mom's side, bumblebee masks, because in the potlatch ceremony, there's bumblebee dances in which a family, including a large number of children, do a dance, and it's pretty informal. But in the dance, one of the children has to get lost in the crowd, and then all of the other bumblebee family wearing their masks will go back until they can find that lost baby bumblebee and bring him or her back into the family. And this is one of the type of dances that were involved bumblebee masks. There were others. Perhaps you might be the next one to get a gift if you got visited by someone wearing a bumblebee mask, especially if you had large, pokers, so whiskers, which is like the sting on the face of the mask. But in this case, for this dance, she was part of the reclaiming of these masks. They're still owned in part by the museum, but those masks were brought back to the family so they could carve new ones that will be theirs and are theirs. And so these live in this limbo. So she said, well, I'll make an art project. And she put pictures of family surrounded by those masks. And so even though I'm the last one, I still count. It was her art project because, so much of the boarding schools and stuff, if you're not familiar with the oppression of Indigenous people and languages, there's a lot of terrible things have happened. And this has been with the mask effort to be resilient in the face of that and restart and rebuild aspects of the potlatch ceremonies that involved generosity and things that were very not capitalistic, which is why that stuff was really frowned upon by the Canadian government, which was Christian run. So there's a great video. You want to watch it? There you go. I just did a screenshot. Even though I'm the last one, I still count, which helps explain some of this further. Encourage you to learn about it. But bumblebees in the Pacific Northwest weren't just great pollinators of things like camas and involved in dances, but they also became important for modern agriculture because honeybees aren't great pollinators of a number of crops, such as tomatoes. So I guess you call them scientists, but learn to commercially manage and build up large numbers of colonies of the Western bumblebee. It was the most common bumblebee, 20 years ago, from Idaho to BC to, kind of central to Southern California or so. A lot of the West, I have a map here, so not quite Southern. I think of San Francisco as Southern because I'm way up toward the top there. So it became large scale, mass produced, and some of the bees were sent to Europe and they were brought back. And this added a whole new stressor because they got some diseases. Even in the UK, between different parts, there's different types of pathogens that are worse. Like if you travel to a new place, you're like, oh, I don't want to get sick from somebody, from a different community. Well, the bumblebees aren't used to pathogens from other areas, so new pathogens can often have a detrimental effect. And that's what we saw. We went from having this as the most common bumblebee to the least common bumblebee, almost. It's pretty much, other than one that is slated for, it's proposed for federal endangered listing. This one was too, but it didn't make it. The other one might still, but this is still like the second least common, and it used to be the most common. And this is in an area that has like 26 bumblebee species. It went from the number 1 to number 25 on the list. It's very rare. If you find it, it's worthy of an entry in an entomological journal. People will be really curious about, how do you find it? Where was it? What was it on? Because we've treated this bee like it's something that is something we can mass produce. And we have another bee on the East Coast. This one is federally endangered, and that's its range there, Bombus affinis, the rusty patch bumblebee. This has seen an over 95% decline in range and abundance, and that whole spread. The thing is, European honeybees take resources like pollen and nectar, and it reduces the amount out there for native bees. They can also spread diseases to native bees, such as Bombus affinis. The mass production of East Coast bumblebees also can spread pathogens. And on that note, I say, if you want to learn more about Bombus affinis and how it became to be listed under the Endangered Species Act, you can watch rustypatch.com. This is called Ghost in the Making. It's also on YouTube and Vimeo. It's worth watching. But I'm going to keep talking about bumblebees, but just a little dip into a non-bumblebee species here, because we are going to South America, where there's a bumblebee in South America worth talking about that has also suffered from non-native bumblebees and mass production of bumblebee colonies. This is Calpolicana. This bee was named, as genus name comes from a Mapuche leader. He was a leader of a resistance against the Spanish conquistadors. So neat. There's other bees like that. I like to think of those. But there's a bumblebee in Chile that's really important to the Mapuche people. And this one, it does live in colonies and it does produce honey. It's the world's largest bumblebee, almost the world's largest bee. I don't know about weight or whatever, but it's nearly the length and width of the world's largest. And it lives in colonies as well. So it does produce, honey and waxen pots. And it was integrated deep with the Mapuche culture, but that is eroded. So right now, less and less people have experiences with this bumblebee because it has become so rare. There's a paper out there in the Journal of Ethnoentomology, the giant bumblebee, Bombus dalbamai in Mapuche cosmovision, which describes some of those relationships. There's a Spanish version as well. The Spanish version went out. The Salvemos Nuestro Abajoro is a group that's working to save the bumblebee, Bombus dalbamai. It's a bee that was once so abundant, people would describe spring as the time that the skies turn orange because of its beautiful orange color. There's a artist performance group, Compañía Biodiversa, in Chile that has made a series of performances that happened this month. Hopefully I can find them on YouTube or Facebook or something. I missed them, but that was inspired by the paper and its description of the Mapuche relationship with the bee being so tight with the forest. The thing is, the introduced bumblebees in Chile were brought there to pollinate blueberries that are set for export to Europe. So it's like Europe is basically, in a policy manner, said, hey, we have this need. We want blueberries. We want lots of blueberries. And we think this is the best pollinator of blueberries. So here's a couple bumblebee species and a lot of them. And here's the blueberries. And the effects now are that the native plants that have real spiritual importance and ecological importance in Chile aren't being pollinated by this native bumblebee because it has suffered drastic declines because of competition, because of disease spreading. This is the information about their performance. So if you're trying to look it up, good luck. But in one Mapuche origin story, that involves the bee. There's a fairy, a spirit, and she takes care of all the flowers in the fields. And the mountain and a spirit in the mountain has become upset, and there's a lot of rumbling. And so people are concerned. She leaves the flowers to go check out the mountain and say, I'll try to calm the mountain spirit down. And it actually takes a long time, months or years. And finally, she has a big battle with the mountain spirit, and boom, it explodes as a volcano. And that's where the Bombus del Balme comes from, the orange fuzzy bee flying out of the lava exploding mountain. And they take over the role of that fairy spirit who took care of the flowers. Now they are the spirit helpers of those flowers. So a nice origin story of thinking of the bees as caretakers of the flowers and coming from a part of the landscape. A real common theme. You find that same theme in Australia. And so in my reading about this type of thing, I'm like, wow, Australian bee lore and bee culture. I'm no longer surprised to find things in books like this because the idea that European honeybees and Europeans were far superior than native bees and native peoples is a common theme. This one is actually saying that this the English bee was the first variety imported to Australia and would be superseded by the Italian variety. But you can see the inherent racism blatant by beekeepers. It was dominate. The goal was domination. The idea was superiority, and get rid of anything and anybody that stands in your way. And so here's another example in a newspaper. The introduced bee has, by their greater number and greater activity and vivacity, almost succeeded in exterminating the little native. This we may look upon as a natural result of advancing civilization, etc. I want to address this now because the survival of the fittest idea, it's not working. It's not working. So I'd say that too often we treat this native bees as well as native peoples, the political systems and people. We can't treat others like, including bees, like they're irrelevant or unimportant or they lack value because they're not us, that they don't have utility because we don't understand it. The importance is that we say, wow, okay, we have to acknowledge that there is value in things we don't understand and that we don't have to know about it for it to be relevant. Too often people look at other bees and they say, oh, well, well, we have honeybees, so these others are, if honeybees take over, well, that just means they're of greater value. They're more evolutionarily fit. And it's like, no, dominating somebody doesn't mean that you're more fit. It has nothing to do with how long and how happy you'll be. It has zero connection. But in Australia, the Yirrkala bark petitions to the Australian Parliament was an effort to get the Australian government to respect traditional Aboriginal land rights. And there wasn't just one bark petition. The first one was 1963. There was another one in 1968 that was associated with like, hey, you can't mine bauxite in this area because this is where Wooyal, the honey ancestor, sat down. And there's a lot to the story. That's the honey ancestor there. So these bark paintings and typewritten descriptions in Yolngu and English were slowly eroded the Australian government's resistance. It took a lot of time, and only recently have really there been, some important but still minor advances in land rights. But this was something where this honey ancestor was part of that. Why is that? A lot of the landscape elements in Northern Australia are thought of being created by certain say dream time, but in a time that involves now and the past, where it's an ongoing relationship where this ancestor and created the landscape. In some cases, it's that you have a man and woman hunting for sugarbag bees. Sugarbag is another term for the stingless colonial bees that live in Australia. There's 11 species. And so they're looking for honey. They're looking for that sugar bag. And everywhere they go, they end up creating different landscape elements. So for Australians, Aboriginal Australians, to look at the land and say someone is going this direction and thinking about this season and caring about that bee that's like that's what it means to be in a place, to stand in a place, to be constantly thinking about bees in general. So you may have heard of Yothu Yindi if you're into world music. That's a group that put together this Barracuda Wild Honey album. There's an example of one of the species of bees in Australia that produces honey and wax. And there's a hollow eucalyptus tree. Now, why would I show that? Because a lot of these stingless bees will nest in hollow trees. Unfortunately, European honeybees like to move in those trees, and a lot of mammals in Australia, a lot of birds in Australia require those hollows. And so there's basically, when the honeybees move in, it reduces the ability of native species to survive. And the competition from feral honeybees is a key threatening process according to the Threatened Species Conservation Act in an area of Australia. So this species is still going around, and people are saying, oh, there's no problem. 30% of Australians believe that there wasn't any massacres of indigenous people, and probably much more than that believe that there's no harm in having honeybees everywhere that if they're from Europe, and ignore the other bee. So these things kind of can go hand in hand, and maybe seeing that connection will help, especially if you're a bee scientist. Maybe check your biases. Maybe if you're someone who in a position of power, maybe recognize that European honeybees aren't the only one that's important to people or to you. Studies show in Australia, European honeybees can remove more than 80% of pollen and nectar, and for multiple plants, that reduces seed set, like the camas example. So is there competition between bees? Scientific evidence really indicates that honeybees, when present, it decreases the native bee foraging and reproductive success. So there'll be less bumblebee colonies that could survive in an area. There'll be less solitary bees that can survive in an area. And often that results in shifts in the pollination of things. And a lot of us, the bees are taking pollen and nectar, and then it's not available. And in some cases, and I see it where I live, honeybees will take pollen right off a native bee. They'll take it off the legs. They'll rough them up a little bit. I see it. It's not the main thing they do, but they certainly do it. So for dramatic effect, and why would I try to be dramatic here? The thing is, there's been so much blurred perceptions and misconstrued ideas that maybe it helps to if I sharpen the focus here and sharpen the contrast, so people can actually believe it when science is telling you something, or when people are telling you something about bees and their relationship with the planet. So these pictures are from, because mine are a little bit blurry, these are from Paula Sharp, Bees of New York. They've got a little guide for Texas bees too, the sharp-eatman-guides.com. They were nice enough to let me use those. This is more on honeybee competition, in which Dr. Cohn says to have a non-native species that removes the lion's share pollen and nectar in a diverse ecosystem such as ours is stunning. Think about if we had an invasive plant that covered 75% of the region's land area. It's similar to that level. And this was a study in California. Another recent report shows that beekeeping reduces the diversity of wild pollinators and the interaction links in the pollination network. And by interaction links, so there's cascading effects. There's a neat study, even fish can impact, your yields of fruit or seeds, because if fish are eating dragonflies, then the dragonflies are less abundant, eating dragonfly larvae in the water, then the dragonfly adults are less abundant. And then the bumblebees have an easier time foraging without worrying about bumblebees catching or dragonflies catching them. And then there's greater seed set for those native plants around a water body. There's so many cascading effects. It's amazing. But one of them is that European honeybees like plants from Europe. And so they do rather well helping those create seeds. So in California and other parts, in Michigan, for example, beekeepers fight to have this non-native star thistle that's really pokey, because they say, look, we wouldn't even have a honey industry in Michigan if we didn't have star thistles.
Wow.
No, I don't know if anyone else likes them.
I hate it.
Yeah, so this is a screenshot from a video where Jim Kane is talking and describing his research, published research, and he's from he was working with the USDA Agricultural Research System, and he points out that every 100 hives removes pollen and nectar enough to produce 10 million native bees. That is the quantity that would have supported like a native solitary bee. So if we look at that, those numbers start adding up. If you extrapolate that, one hive has a big impact. The 3 million, estimated in the United States has a big impact. And then you look at like the over 80 million as of like 2016 or something estimates of managed commercial honeybee colonies. That's not feral ones. And how many other bees are slowly going by the wayside, and indigenous relationships with those creatures, and any relationships that anyone could develop with them. These massive migratory beekeeping for monoculture, it creates when we have monoculture here, like here, where you have a lot of almond trees or a lot of blueberries, there's not necessarily a lot of habitat for other bees, any other pollinators. So what happens is, well, then you have to bring in a lot more of honeybees. They may not be the most effective pollinator of blueberries. It may take 100 visits or so, I'm guessing. Who knows how many visits, but it takes more visits to a blueberry flower by a honeybee and more honeybees to visit it than it takes a bumblebee. So we have to like mass produce and mass stock honeybees because they are the least effective. And some studies are showing that if we have a pollinator hedgerow that supports nesting and foraging for native bees, then you can actually get yields equivalent to that if you didn't even turn any of your orchard into a native bee habitat. But that monoculture and agriculture creates a monoculture in bees, and that has some cascading effects. So when all those bees are done visiting a crop like almonds, they're brought somewhere else, and eventually they're brought to like, well, you got to have more and more of them. Eventually, you got to bring them somewhere else. So people are, bringing them, beekeepers bring them to national forests to get them as close to national parks. They look at maps to say, where's the best foraging in the US? And so these bees aren't just pollinating almonds, they're also getting pollen and nectar from our wildlands where our native bees are. The last places, where they are in the abundances that they are. So, for example, here's a mason bee on the top. Why is it a better pollinator than honeybee? It doesn't take as many of them to pollinate an acre of apples, or almonds. Well, they tend to fly from tree to tree, and trees like to have pollen from a different tree to make a fruit. If it's pollen from the same tree, it's more likely to be lopsided and it'll roll off your teacher's table. Whereas if it's coming from a different tree, it's more likely to make a fruit with less pollen. So, and the mason bee carries pollen on her, the bottom of her abdomen. And so that a lot of it will be transferred to the next flower. The honeybee, on the other hand, says, oh, I have a stinger I'm willing to use because I don't care if I upset you because I'm not the egg-laying mother. The mason bee up top is the egg-laying mother. She's very shy about being caught by a person, a wasp or anything else. She doesn't want to be eaten by a bird, because she's the mother. The worker bee has a little different attitude and is a little bit more expendable. And if she dies, it's not the genetic lineage that dies. It's just one of, say, 50,000 in the hive or so. So she tends to just go in the same tree and not be as tricky. And she takes that pollen, presses it between her, she presses it in her pollen press, packs it on her corbicula on the side, and many of those pollen grains are smushed, and they're all pushed to the side, so very few, and moistened with nectar, so very few of them go to the next flower. And if it does, it's still usually on the same tree. So mason bees will operate in cooler weather, etc., for spring blue stuff that's helpful. But all these tiny details about this one bee, it makes it more effective. But if we don't have nesting habitat for that one, for the mason bee, then we have to bring in a lot more of this other bee. And the honeybee requires stuff blooming in the end of summer. The mason bee doesn't require, that species doesn't require anything blooming in July or August or September. So different needs that make some much more practical. So honeybees, what I say is they are classified as agricultural livestock. We commercially produce them. There's more colonies of them in the world now than there were 50 years ago. And pretty much the same could be said for the US. So I want to say that raising honeybees to save pollinators is like raising chickens to help birds. You know, it is one of the birds. It's not the one that's endangered. And a lot of people are already, you know, keeping them. It's okay to have a good relationship with chickens, but don't imagine that that's saving the rest of the other birds, please. You know, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So that's what it's like. You know, there's yellow-faced bees. There's 7 species in Hawaii that are endangered, just like the bird you saw there. And both of them would rather visit a native plant that is not being visited by a honeybee. And there's a lot of honeybees in Hawaii. I talked to beekeepers there who said, oh, the good old days before we had any of the problems that came, like hive beetles, you know, they said the ohia lahua blossoms would be so covered in honeybees, you wouldn't even see the red flowers. And, you know, that sounded good to them, but it certainly isn't good for the nectar feeding endemic species on the islands. So it's a little bit like keeping cows too, keeping honeybees. You know, I drink milk. I have, and I haven't at times, but you know what I mean? Like cows, you can have a good relationship with them. Cows aren't inherently evil at all, and neither are honeybees. But keeping a cow does not help you save the bison. Okay, that's what I want people to understand, is that it's not the same. The more we learn about pollination ecology, the more we can say that 1 out of every 3 bites of food you eat depends on what we're benefiting from in the ecosystem depends on bee diversity. This is a slide from a safari insecticide. People want to know, like, how about the insecticides? Are they hurting bees? Yes, they are definitely hurting bees. And they can be a little bit more indiscriminate than a hunter taking aim. So this is pictures I took in Eugene, Oregon, where that safari was used on some linden trees, and the bees were dying all around them. And this, what I want to emphasize here is that there are kids riding their little 3-wheelers over dead bumblebees on the sidewalk. And the honeybees, they were visiting and flying away. So they were less susceptible. The bumblebees were visiting and dropping. You know, so every bee species can be can have different effects from pesticides. And when we don't consider the effect of a pesticide on a native bee, especially when it's a pollinator of the crop we're using a pesticide on, it's really nonsensical. But that's the way our legislation is set up. It's to prefer, you know, we require studies on a honeybee for pesticide safety. We don't require it for other species, even if they're the ones that are the best pollinator of the crop the pesticide is used on. So there's a lot of injustice when it comes to bee diversity. And we think of that. Here's Marla Spivak. She's got a great TED Talk you can watch on why bees are disappearing. She points out that every batch of pollen that a honeybee collects in some studies has at least 6 detectable pesticides in it. And all those pesticides, they've had a pesticide safety assessment for the safety of that honeybee, but only individually. So they didn't have to look at additive effects. You know, if I had a doctor that said, here's this pain medicine for this, and here's your heart medicine, and they didn't think about how those would work together on me, and how maybe, so then we'll tell you, you won't be good at driving, or you know, or operating any sort of, you know, heavy equipment. Well, we don't say that to honeybees. We say, well, if you can have one, you can have the other, and have it together. We don't know about additive or synergistic effects. We're not going to bother looking at it. And we certainly don't think enough about the other bees out there that are not honeybees that may have different susceptibilities to the pesticides, different exposure routes. 97% of bees nest in the ground, and those bees are solitary. So think of like a abandoned ant hole that you thought you saw. Probably was a bee nest entrance. And they have a direct exposure for something like a glyphosate, something that's sprayed right in the ground. Okay, compared to a honeybee hive, which, not. So she also says in this TED Talk, like that bee with those pesticides that's maybe getting a little confused is holding up a very large mirror for ourselves. If we look at the stuff that's happening to bees, we can also imagine what's happening to ourselves. And I think that's important that we don't look at humans as in charge. We don't look at the honeybees as having this manifest righteous, manifest destiny that are bringing civilization. We've asked, are we asking a lot of honeybees? Maybe, but I wonder if we're even asking at all, or if we expect and demand their duty as pollinators, that we were counting on them so much to be part of our system here. And we haven't thought about respecting the diversity of bees out there. We kind of have this settled expectation that there shouldn't be a pollination crisis. Somehow it was surprising. We had plenty of warnings, but there was a pollination crisis long before pesticides. There was a pollination crisis because we didn't care about the other pollinators and the relationships with people they had. Here's an example of change. We've all heard like, when you describe a family member, maybe they've really blossomed this year, maybe because they got good at reading or riding a bike. And it's more about like, personal advancement in those descriptions. Good in itself, but I also want to look at the Canelos Quichua people in Ecuador in their concept of blossoming. They have the same type of thing, but I think there's a little bit more depth to what I'm currently describing the American idea of blossoming there. And that a bud flower opening is blossoming, is calling spirit helpers such as bees and butterflies. And they are little spirit helpers for the people as well. And when you use that as to describe a person blossoming, it means that they're actually opening their heart and soul to spirit helpers in the people and animal range. And I think that's what we need to do as people, is to open our hearts to the other people and other bees that we maybe haven't considered important. If you're looking at it from an international scale, there's some reports out there that look at the indigenous relationships and knowledge of pollinators and pollination that are helpful if you're trying to research more. So here's a couple reports. Which describe how Western science has a lot to catch up with people. I can think of an example. The Calpolicana people in Brazil, recognize, I think, over 55 different species of stingless bee, and it required a genetic analysis to figure out that there was more than that. There was like 60 species within their 55 categories, but they have all the names already for the different types of wax, resins, and qualities of honey, and what they're good for depending on the time of year for each of those 55 species. It's that amount of depth of knowledge. And they have direct field experience on the other bees and their impacts. So working with indigenous people to understand how forests are changing is really important. So these reports are supportive of those efforts. Considering the role of pollination within local management practices. And a more recent report for this one in 2016 looks at a lot of those same things. Locally, I'm working with the Hoopa Valley Historical Alliance. This is on the Hoopa Valley Reservation in Northern California to protect some bees. They live in a historic place, recognized by the federal government as a historic place. This is a building that is inhabited by a large number of Anthophora bomboides. Sometimes it's called the bumblebee mimic bee. This says here, the Hoopa ancestors were successful against all odds in the mid-1800s to preserve the Hoopa Valley for their people. And this building, unfortunately, was part of the Army fort, and then it was part of the boarding school where people went to lose their native language, which is beautiful. The Hoopa language recognizes different genera of wasps, different kinds of bees, and more in the entomology world. In specific bees, in beautiful ways. This bee reclaimed this native soil that was turned into this building. And when this building was abandoned, the Anthophora bomboides aggregation got very large. So there's this group that wants to restore this building as a monument to Hoopa resilience in the face of the introduction of, domestic violence, by the U.S. Army and other things. So it's a worthy cause. I'm serving to help with conserving the native bees. So as this wall is taken down and replaced, getting the Anthophora bees to a new place, a nearby, very close by community garden where elders and children both can, it's between the Senior Nutrition Center and the school for the Hoopa. And we could make something out of it that would be great so people could learn about this wonderful bee. You're going to see a video of this bee. This is a close-up of the upper level of the house. You can see there's a lot of, and these are solitary bees that are nesting in an aggregation. They all think it's a great place to be. And here's a little video. I'm looking up at the upper floor. So I'm standing on the ground, kind of looking up. You see the roof. And you might get an idea of the level of activity. These are large bees. They have, black and yellow hairs. I don't have a great close-up right here in this presentation. But what I'm hoping for the Hoopa community is to have a bee wall even much bigger than this. This is the University of Maryland put up this bee wall for a different Anthophora species. It's made out of like adobe and cob, as well as some other materials that allow people to come and learn about native bees and their importance as pollinators in the ecosystem and for our food and medicine plants. And I am imagining this for the native community here in Humboldt County. And I have a way that people can help if they can. There's a tax-deductible 501c3 nonprofit Humboldt Area Foundation that's serving to assist the Hoopa Valley Historical Alliance Fund. And if you go to that website and find the Hoopa Valley Historical Alliance Fund, you can indicate that the funds will go toward conserving the adobe house bees for the Hoopa community, because part of the process of redoing that house, redoing that building, is making sure we don't harm the bees. And so having the funds to set up the spot on the garden would be wonderful. Donations are tax deductible. Okay, so if you want to reach me, if you have questions, you can write me at nativebeesociety@gmail.com. And I hope I got some of my messages across. I try to make it short, so I'm missing, filling you in with data and every, instance when I say something, and I can make mistakes as I speak. So I thank you for putting up with that. And hopefully this has kind of offered you a fresh perspective on people's relationship with bees and, allowed us to be thoughtful and where to go from here.
Brian, can you take us back to the link for where we can make the donation?
Yeah, there you go.
And then what kind of language should we use when we want to earmark it for the preservation of the wall?
I would just say, mention the bees. Make sure the bees are conserved for the Hoopa community. They'll do wonderful. The garden is just like a block and a half away. The bees will have everything they need for a minor move. And I before COVID hit, I was giving some presentations to high schoolers and younger on making some adobe bricks, and we can make them really messy. It'd be easier for the bees to move into them. So like some kind of what we call trap nesting bricks. something we can convince the bees to move into some other ones and hopefully conserve them. Hopefully we can work with the architect. We can to make sure that the wall is rebuilt in a time where we can the bees are not active or as active. I want to connect with and help support local Native artists in the community to make that educational bee wall in the community garden really beautiful and meaningful for the community. So I had a great talk with people. It just it was like two rivers merging. The community was like, oh, exactly. We don't allow pesticides on the reservation, and we want to conserve this pollinator. So let's work together on that. But a lot of this is dependent on funds. So we can have the resources for the and incentives for the artists and for the youth to be involved. Yeah, there's some resources that we need for that.
Great, thank you. So some of the takeaways that I'm getting, and thank you very much. This is a very informative presentation. Makes us think about native bees and Western influence in a different way, especially as it relates to native bees and native cultures. So some of the takeaways that I wanted to mention was that the honeybee has a devastating effect on a very wide range of native species, that not only are the native bees reduced, but also the traditions, the cultures, the agriculture of native peoples is also affected. And then this is kind of dim, that the introduction of European honeybees, understood or not, is an act of genocide and has been in the Americas and Australia. But there have been a lot of comments in the chat, so I'm going to ask people to unmute themselves, and we can begin asking Brian questions and making comments.
Okay. I'm afraid of doing the video. I live in a rural community, and I don't want to impact the sound as we're talking. Okay. I don't have great internet. Glad it worked.
Are you saying, what are you telling me?
Oh, I'm just going to leave the video off
okay.
So that people can hear me the best.
Okay, great.
Brian, if you just turn off the sharing, there should be enough connection for maybe just the video.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I think it's the both that was taking up the Wi-Fi.
Okay.
Well, I'll have a question. This is Christina in Southern Oregon. Obviously, we can't really get together in person much anymore, but I would love to share this presentation. Obviously, I'll get the recording link and I will do that. But I didn't know if there were going to be other opportunities for you to be making presentations or doing in-person kind of tours of the Humboldt wall, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if there's ways that we can get together again, either virtually or physically, to help spread the word. It's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing this. It's really inspiring.
Well, you're welcome. Yeah, Zoom does make meetings easier, but I have a lot of responsibilities that makes the presentations they can't come too often. And anyway, yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I hope it was helpful for everybody, to know that there's a positive efforts in every area of the world, and there's lots of areas I didn't cover, unlimited people and things I didn't cover, but in every place there's positive momentum with native peoples and native bees that can be supported. And one resource, if you're looking like, well, how do I help? There's these other bees that make honey. There is an organization called Slow Food. I didn't make a slide about it. I meant to. They have done a lot to support people's efforts to use native bees with honey around the world. They have a lot of projects going on right now, especially compared to like 10 years ago. They have really, that has really taken off. I understand that there's issues that can arise with commercialization and, ecotourism of just turning native, culture and native bees into money, native plants into money. It's not always the best, but when these things are done right, it can really allow people a lot of wiggle room, and allow the native bees in these cases a lot of wiggle room, to be autonomous.
Are there any other questions for Brian?
Yeah, I've got one. The concept of cultural taxonomy is absolutely fascinating to me. I mean, the power of naming things is really prevalent. But how would one find resources? Is there a resource for the practice of cultural taxonomy, kind of like the where you talked about the what was it, the cultural ethnosphere that you referred to? Is there one that's specifically about the kind of like specific systems of classification that other cultures have?
It's a good question. A lot of the resources I use to understand the world in the way that I've tried to, and that went into this presentation, et cetera, are really disparate. They're really, they're diverse. I would say, though, there's a number of groups, like you saw the Terralingua, but also, culturalsurvival.org. I interned with them there. It's led by an Indigenous woman, and it's a great organization helping Indigenous people with their cultural autonomy and language revitalization or preservation. But the Journal of Ethnobiology is a good one, and the Society for Ethnobiology was founded by Professor Daryl Posey, and he's the person who worked with the Kayapo in Brazil. He even helped them go to the United Nations because of land right issues. He was imprisoned in Brazil for doing that. He's an example of a scientist who was interested in, a traditional ecological knowledge, but also about, being a respectful person, not pretending like the people that he's learning from didn't require the same amount of rights as the rest of people there in Brazil or around the world. And they have a great set of ethics and the Society for Ethnobiology regarding research that is worth looking at.
Oh, thank you.
Yep.
I've got a question. Do you think in terms of sort of conservation and just habitat restoration in general, do sort of, say, like park planners or sort of urban environment planners, do they need to put more effort into planting flowers or native plants that could attract them? Yeah, like attract sort of native species of bees. Is that an issue in America? Because it is an issue to a certain extent in parks in the UK. They'll plant sort of ornamental species from, say, China, because they'll just go, oh, it looks nice.
Yeah, well, I would say to that, I got into bees because of my interest in plants. So let's start there. Our primary producers are really important. They create the potential, and both, for the pollen, nectar, resins, oils that bees may need. And the native bees will definitely benefit from native plants. And, yeah, and thinking about, as people say, well, I guess the other side of the Atlantic, in places where honeybees are native. And, these things I didn't get into in the Apis mellifera, a species that's native from Europe all the way to southern Africa. And there's subspecies different throughout there, and the subspecies of the honeybee really impacts when they're going to flowers. So there's the time of colony buildup in a honeybee will, over time, it will, those varieties or subspecies of honeybee, they would match the floral resources. So there'd be a lot of new forager bees at a time when there'd be a lot of floral resources. So there was a phenology match. Where I live, the only honeybees are ones that are surviving wild in the trees, and I can go look at them. Those are the ones I go look at to see what pollen they're bringing in. And then the neighbors, and they keep honeybees. And I know, because I talk to my neighbors too, oh, they're feeding sugar right now. They bought new bees, and I can see there's a sudden influx of bees looking for flowers. And I have 99% natives on I have a food farm, and I grow native plants, including ones that are native foods. And on my annual hedgerows of native plants, it'll be 99% native bees one day, and then that 1% did a waggle dance and said, this is really nicely planted, and all those honeybees will show up. And they're not there because they've always been there. They're not there because they're the best pollinator of those plants. They're there because there's a lot. Honeybees, as a large colonial, kind of superorganism, they'll avoid small patches. They're not going to pollinate the calypso orchid you find in the northern hemisphere. Those queen bumblebees, the time of year, the size of the bee, honeybees, if they visit a tomato plant, it's possible they can move pollen, but they show up and they go, there's no nectar. I have a hard time getting the pollen. I don't make the right sounds, because bees make different sounds, and that can impact whether they can retrieve pollen from the anthers or not. And so the honeybee's going to show up and be like, okay, well, I came, I saw, and I left, and I'm not dancing about this. They don't go home and dance and say, oh, my sisters, let's go and forage on the tomato patch. And even if they decide to go forage somewhere, like on my native plants, that doesn't mean they're pollinating it well. So yeah, the buildup of the local bees here, I can watch, is very different. So you have efforts in Turkey to say, oh, where we have this Anatolian honeybee that really matches the native flora here in the colony buildup and slow down. But people say, oh, this is wonderful plants there, so they bring the Italians in. So the native subspecies that's helpful for the environment, as that honeybee, is not doing so well. And a number of studies in Europe show that the quantity of honeybees, they compete with each other, and they compete with native bees. Now, I have talked to a lot of beekeepers who say, there's no, bees, they like different kinds of flowers. I'm like, that's true, but bees will, collect pollen off their least favorite flower if it's the only thing. And they say, well, but I don't think they compete with the native bees. The honeybees wouldn't compete with native bees because they like different flowers. And I just want to, try to help them understand, like they'll go to the same flower, and can I move a 200 hive apiary next to your 2 hives and see what happens? Your hive is more likely to get disease, because of contact, and they're not going to produce as much honey. So you have there was one slide there. I don't know if there's text with it about like a hive unit month. How much does a hive need, one colony of honeybees, to survive in 1 month? How many flowers? And if you looked at like your neighborhood and said, well, how many honeybees can I support here without buying some sugar produced by somebody else in some other part of the world, converting some other kind of native, ecosystem, so I could have sugar to feed my bees, 81 million colonies of bees, and how many of them, those managed bees, are getting like corn syrup or sugar to make it through an environment, because there isn't enough forage for them. They're not adapted to that environment. So, it's a setup for a failure, because people aren't, the bees, we're not letting the bees act in place. We're controlling where they go, and we're asking them to do things that they can't. So we have to reduce those expectations of honeybees and say, well, we can't expect them to just pollinate all of nature and fulfill all of our diverse cultural needs. It's not going to happen at all.
Okay, we're running out of time. It's actually 16 minutes past time. Are there any pressing questions? If not, we want to get final comments from Terry, and then I want to give us one parting thought.
Well, I just want to thank you, and really getting my mind going. I do presentations frequently about different pollinators and stress native bees, but this gives me a whole other angle to use. So thank you so much.
Yes. Right. And if there are more comments for
welcome.
Brian, yeah, please put them in the chat so he can look at them later. So my final thought before we close is appropriate for the holiday weekend. We're all stewards of the ecosystem, and as a service project, there's usually a service project that our group does in for the MLK. What is it called? The MLK holiday service or something like that. But
Day of service.
yeah, MLK Day of Service. Thank you. So the thought I have is, since we are all stewards and we're all doing some kind of service, hopefully this weekend, is this one. It says, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. So as we're working on our service projects, as we're thinking about pollinators, let's keep that quote in mind. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody.